Set in the 1840s America, a group of Africans that were illegally sold into slavery were arrested and put on trial for the mutiny and murder of the crew of the La Amistad. To overcome the political and judicial obstacles that involves two countries and slave owners, as well as dealing with the threats of a civil war in the United States, Sinke, played by Jaime Hansel in his first starring role, must accept help from strangers in this strange land to navigate him through the complicated process. Helping him are lawyer Roger Baldwin, played by Matthew McConaughey, ex-slave turned abolitionist Theodore Jolson, played by Morgan Freeman, and ex-president John Quincy Adams, played by Anthony Hopkins in an Oscar-nominated performance. Despite that it is directed by one of the most popular filmmakers in cinema history, Steven Spielberg, Amistad isn't as well remembered or beloved as his other more successful films in his illustrious career. The true story of the Amistad case was brought to his attention by producer Debbie Allen, the reason being because she believed that he could give the same treatment to this incredible story in our nation's history as he did with Schindler's List. There was controversy over the fact that a white director was chosen to tell a story about African slavery in America, not to mention the criticisms of his historical inaccuracies that plagued the film. However, when looking at the film in its aesthetic sense, I could see that Spielberg really took great care with the making of this movie. This is a period piece done in nearly the old-fashioned way, with its set pieces from the courtrooms to the slave ships out in the middle of the ocean to give it a more authentic look, along with the costumes and makeup that makes it feel like they transported themselves to that time period. Not only does it look great, but it does help me feel immersed in the settings. The story itself takes us through the whole history of the case, from the mutiny on board the ship to the victory of the United States Supreme Court, and there is a lot for them to show. The film is around 2.5 hours long, a quite beefy film that looks at different angles. The heart of the entire piece is following Sinke along with his fellow prisoners. Sinke, in his physicality, looks like a very fearsome individual, but as the film progresses, there are so many nuances with his character. Jaime Hansel gives so much to the historical character that makes him feel so alive that I find myself just drawn not to the performance, but to a real human being. He's intelligent, humble, and he tries to understand the workings of this strange land with his strange customs that it would frustrate him, as all he wants to do is return home to his family. But in order to do so, he has to rely on the people that he cannot communicate without a translator. One of the first people that he lays his trust is property lawyer Roger S. Baldwin. For his character, I pretty much have no doubt that he was cast in order to draw in a younger audience. Even so, Matthew McConaughey does give a fine performance. It isn't explained in the film why Baldwin will be interested in the African's case in the first place, but he is recognized to be a passionate abolitionist in real life. Whatever the reason may be, Baldwin believes that the best way to handle the case is to prove whether the Africans were slaves from Cuba, as the prosecution claims, or kidnapped and sold into slavery from Africa, an illegal practice at that point. This may make him seem disinterested in the plight of the Africans, because he would still treat them as livestock rather than human beings in a court of law, but the abolitionist movement kind of shows some of their colors when they express the opinion that martyrdom may be the best way in terms of furthering their cause by sacrificing the Africans who are most likely to be executed upon conviction. This shows Baldwin that he has the practicality of what the situation is calling for, and while the abolitionist movement is a just cause and is correct in terms of the immorality of slavery, they seem to not understand that the issue is a little different. These men were not born into slavery, and slave trading from Africa is illegal. So by that legal standard, these men were and always has been free. In other words, you can talk all about the horrors of the practice, but all what the court cares about is whether or not any laws were broken, in this case slave trading from the west coast of Africa. Morality and law are pretty much separate from each other, and I think that Baldwin understands that, and Theodore Jolson, the ex-slave turned abolitionist, sees that as well. Jolson is a fictional character written for this film, one that I cannot figure out his purpose. He is more of a passive character as he watches from the sidelines from the beginning all the way up to the end as he interacts with the historical characters. My guess is that he's supposed to be somewhat of an avatar for the audience, learning about the political and judicial sides of the story as a way to understand how people think and reason in this time period, especially when it comes to the issue of slavery. Freeman has always been a great actor to watch, and he is no less than perfect in this one. His role may be limited, but his subtlety is probably used to his advantage, as he doesn't try to steal the scene but to add to his richness. Just seeing his face reacting to other characters you could almost read what he is thinking makes him a joy to watch. And speaking of joys to watch, Anthony Hopkins as John Quincy Adams is my favorite of his performances. Yes, even more so than his iconic role Dr. Hannibal Lecter. He is shown as a bit of an eccentric, but there is certainly a lot more to him as the film progresses. After a presidency that was a failure, Adams, who is a staunch abolitionist, was very reluctant to take on the case, often pushing it aside whenever it was presented to him. But when it went all the way to the Supreme Court, he has to bite the bullet. Whenever we see him in his more quieter moments, he looks scared or even ashamed of himself because not only did he have a presidency that amounted to nothing, but he was a son of a founding father who did not live up to his father's legacy. But when he finally accepts the case to represent CK and speaks to him, it almost looks as though he is rejuvenated by CK's words about his ancestors and how he will call for their wisdom and strength to win, and that is what Adams used in his 10-minute speech in the Supreme Court. A highlight of the film that encapsulates all of the themes that the film explored, this scene gives Hopkins the spotlight as Adams explains to the court about what America is supposed to represent while conquering his own personal and political demons. It's all shot and edited very simply yet wonderfully. It doesn't feel long or short, and it pretty much acts as a conclusion for the thesis of the entire film. A much bigger highlight is in the middle of the film where CK can finally talk to us and give us his backstory as to who he is and how did he get to America. What follows is nothing short of horrific. Without any dialogue for a good amount of time, Spielberg tells CK's story of his abduction and his journey across the Atlantic. There are images of just savage brutality by the slavers as the Africans are dragged naked in chains, all cramped down below in the bowels of the ship. They were sexually abused, whipped, and even thrown overboard. This part may be hard to watch, but it should be if it means giving us a glimpse of what it's like to be on a slave ship. I've had 3 history professors, 2 of them that specialize in slavery, say that this part is a fair representation when basing on historical evidence. So far, I have been giving this film a lot of credit for what it accomplished and just how good it all come together. However, there are some flaws that I found with this. First off, there is talk of civil war when it comes to the outcome of the case, but there is no mention of secession. While slavery was definitely a hot issue at the time and there was Bleeding Kansas in the 1850s, most of the slave states were threatening to separate from the Union as they see it as an issue of states' rights and the northern states not respecting them. It is a minor issue that hardly tainted the film for me, but I think they could have fitted it in when talk of civil war was first mentioned. And there is a moment or two that feels overdramatic in a film that is telling its story as subtle as it can. Like the moment when CK cries for freedom in the middle of the courtroom with a swelling piece of music by John Williams. Give us free! I get what Spielberg wanted to do, but he could have toned it down a bit. Of course, the film has received its more than fair share of criticisms of how inaccurate it is to the real story, but even if I do know the whole story, I probably wouldn't care about how historically inaccurate it is. This film is so well done and very engaging with its characters that I think that this is the best way to tell the biggest number of people of this story that was mostly forgotten. It brings a human side to an historical event in our country to the general public and about a topic that is generally uncomfortable to talk about, and it doesn't shy away from the horrors of slavery while celebrating the triumphs of moral integrity. It keeps its focus on the characters that matters the most, giving them the screen time for me to get to know and care for, and the actors really put themselves into their shoes. The film may not be as well known today as I believe it should be, but for me, it certainly is a film that I won't forget and one that I don't mind revisiting over and over.